World War II never saw fights of the war parties in Palestine. However, following the failing of the London Conference, the British decided for a policy that was outlined in the so-called White Paper. It made concessions to the Arab Palestinians because it was essential for the British Empire to cling on to Egypt, Iraq and Saudi Arabia. The London Conference 1939 had seen Chaim Weizmann demand that Jews in Palestine must be the majority and marked Ben-Gurion's ascent to the prime mover in Zionist policymaking. It also saw a change in his thinking towards what he called combative Zionism. He believed that the 440,000 Jews in Palestine, of whom around 45,000 were armed, were strong enough to defend themselves and could kill the Palestinians easily. His priority was continued and increased immigration, particularly young people of military age. Final proposals for agreement of Colonial Secretary Malcolm MacDonald were published on 17th of May 1939 and were rejected by the Arab Palestinians. The Zionist answer were riots in Jerusalem, a general strike and Jewish attacks on Arabs and government property throughout the summer of 1939. The Irgun claimed to have killed more than 130 people during that period. There was also an increase in illegal immigration, with 6,323 arrivals between April and October. The White Paper was a governing policy from 1939 until 1948, when the mandate ended and the British left. The paper called for the establishment of an independent Palestinian state, jointly governed by Arabs and Jews within 10 years. It limited Jewish immigration to 75,000 for the following 5 years and ruled that further immigration would then be determined by the Arab majority. Jews were restricted from buying Arab land in all but 5% of the mandate to maintain the existing standard of life of Arab cultivators and to prevent the creation of a considerable landless Arab population. It stated that the fear of the Arabs that the influx of Jewish immigration will continue indefinitely until the Jewish population is in a position to dominate them has produced consequences which are extremely grave for Jews and Arabs alike and for the peace and prosperity of Palestine. If in these circumstances immigration is continued up to the economic absorptive capacity of the country, regardless of all other considerations, a fatal enmity between the two peoples will be perpetuated and the situation in Palestine may become a permanent source of friction amongst all peoples in the Near and Middle East. In reaction to the White Paper, the Zionist leadership considered a coup, which was not carried out. Ben-Gurion declared, "We will fight the White Paper as if there is no war, and fight the war as if there is no White Paper." The Palestinians agreed at last in July 1940. December 1942, when the extermination of the Jews in Europe became public knowledge, 34,000 immigration certificates were left available. In February 1943, the British government announced that the remaining certificates could be used as soon as practicable to rescue Jewish children from southeastern Europe. In July, it was announced that any Jewish refugee who reached a neutral country in transit would be given clearance for Palestine. During 1943, about half the remaining certificates were distributed, and by the end of the war, there were 3,000 certificates left. After the war, the determination of genocide survivors to reach Palestine led to large-scale illegal Jewish immigration. British efforts to block the migration led to violent resistance by the Zionist underground. By mid-1947, almost 18,000 illegal immigrants detained by the British government were interned in camps on Cyprus. The immigrants had no citizenship and could not be returned grant to any country. Quota of 1,500 certificates for Jewish immigrants per month continued until the end of the mandate in 1948. After World War II, the British Empire declined rapidly. After it had exploited and devastated it for centuries, the British Crown lost India after a decades-long struggle. On June 3, 1947, the last British Governor-General of India announced the partitioning of British India into India and Pakistan. On August 15, 1947, India became a sovereign state, and Britain had reached out to the US asking for help in the war. The US had offered help under the condition of Britain decolonizing post-World War II. That agreement was codified in the Atlantic Charter. The decolonization of Britain also meant that the US and other countries could have access to markets to sell goods which were not accessible to them then. To bring about these changes, the establishment of the UN following World War II codified sovereignty for nations and encouraged free trade. After the drafting of the Charter of the United Nations was completed and it was signed on June 26, 1945 by the representatives of 50 countries, the UN officially came into existence on October 24, 1945. In 1947, the British government gave up on the provision of the Palestine Mandate to render administrative assistance and advice until such time as the establishment in Palestine of a national home for the Jewish people was able to stand alone. The United Nations took up the question of Palestine in February 1947. By this time, all countries in the Middle East formerly under mandates were independent. The only exception was Palestine, where it should have provided a transition to independence. The mandate's commitment to the interpretation of the Balfour Declaration had created a situation where conflict between Arabs and Jews could not be solved. Meanwhile, in 1947, violence continued to spread in Palestine as Zionist terrorist groups, now on the offensive, stepped up their attacks and sabotage. The first special session of the United Nations General Assembly convened on April 28, 1947 to consider the question of Palestine. The United Nations Special Committee on Palestine, UN SCOP Charter, contained no reference to the termination of the mandate and independence for Palestine, and the issue of Jewish European refugees had been linked with Palestine. In front of UN SCOP visiting Palestine, Ben-Gurion stated in June 1947, "We stand by the attitude we took last year, that we will be ready to consider the question of a Jewish state in an adequate area of Palestine, and that we are entitled to Palestine as a whole." He also said that if a United Nations decision in favor of Zionist aims provoked violent protests from the Palestinian Arabs, we will take care of ourselves. The Arab counter-arguments were, with the doors of the country wide open to immigration and financial support from outside, the Jewish state would become extremely populated. As soon as it would go beyond a certain limit in numbers, it would no longer be a state where Jews could come and be safe, but it would become a bridgehead against the Arab world. This is what we absolutely want to avoid, and according to the UN Charter, the people of Palestine shall decide the destiny of Palestine. In Europe, in so-called assembly centers for about 250,000 displaced Jews, it was found that considerable propaganda was carried out by or on behalf of the Jewish Agency, which deemed itself the representative organization of world Jewry, with the objective of inducing Jews to immigrate into Palestine, although those staying in these camps as a general rule agreed, if they were afforded opportunities, to go to other places. The UN SCOP's report, presented in August 1947, proposed a partition because the committee found the claims to Palestine of the Arabs and the Jews were irreconcilable, and that among all of the solutions advanced, partition would provide the most realistic and practicable settlement for meeting in part the claims aims and national aspirations of both parties, said there are now in Palestine some 650,000 Jews and some 1,200,000 Arabs who are dissimilar in their ways of living and, for the time being, separated by political interests which render difficult full and effective political cooperation among them, whether voluntarily or induced by constitutional arrangements. The UN SCOP had witnessed that in many respects the country was living under a semi-military regime due to profound tensions. The primary purpose of the Palestine government in the circumstances of recurring terrorist attacks was to maintain what it regarded as the essential conditions of public security. In one case, 3 members of the Irgun were executed for terrorist activities. In retaliation, in a wider wave of violence, 2 British sergeants kidnapped by the Irgun were murdered, as announced before by Irgun leader Menachem Begin. When the case was discussed and voted for as of November the 29th, 1947, the General Assembly of the United Nations, consisting then of 58 states, denying the right of self-determination given in its own charter, following the heavy political pressure which was used by interested powers to gather the votes for the required 2/3 majority, decided on the partition of Palestine into 2 states according to this map. The fact that the whole of the Negev desert was given to Israel was due to a chat between Chaim Weizmann and US President Harry S. Truman before the US delegation had misunderstood the importance of the monopoly of the harbor of Aqaba as gate to the Indian Ocean. Besides, Truman, who had ordered the drop of the 2nd and 3rd ever nuclear bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the resolution was endorsed by Joseph Vissarionovich Stalin. According to the resolution 181, Britain would withdraw its presence by the 1st of August 1948. During the transitional period beginning immediately, the United Nations would progressively take over the administration in the entire territory, to be exercised through a commission, and power was to be handed over to the 2 states on the day of independence, not later than the 1st October 1948. The 2 states were to be linked in an economic union. Immediately afterwards, the Zionists started the ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians.